So this is my studio in Marlborough, Vermont. Don't ask me how I got to Vermont. That's a really long story. But what you should know is that I grew up in Philadelphia. So here is an image actually that my wife took. And we went back some time ago to where I come from. And I love this image for many reasons. One of them is because it's sort of a strip in Philadelphia of houses with stairs, but the stairs sort of go to nowhere, which is a really great metaphor for where I come from. One of the other interesting things, if you look at this image, is all the trash, but you sort of have this like plain opaque wall, right? And so one of the reasons why we came here is because this is sort of a place that I considered a safe place, not to hang out at because it wasn't safe. It was really the place where everybody would go to do drugs because nobody wanted to be in this neighborhood. But one of the reasons why it was safe for me was because one of the ways that I would try to fit in as a teenager is I do graffiti so that I can be cool like my much cooler cousins. And I was really one of those kids that didn't have a connection to society in many ways. And so I tried to fit in so many places. I was a people pleaser, and so that really turned people off. And so with graffiti, I would paint. But the interesting part about that is the city would come in and they'd cover up my paint. And I just, looking back, when you sort of get to the point where, you know, you're in life and let's say you're going to college, you tend to look back at life and from an entirely different perspective. They say perhaps what one wants to say we conceive of in our childhood and we spend the rest of our life trying to say it. And so for me, looking back at this image makes me realize that there is something really important about this image being covered up. And I think it was that there was sort of some threat involved in me sort of painting graffiti. There was some message, sort of a subliminal message in someone who didn't have art classes making art nonetheless. Another fun fact about stairs is many years ago, I would say, I was about 6 years old. My mom and I sat on these steps, and back then you'd get a credit card application. You could pick whether you wanted a Visa or MasterCard. And my mom looks at me and she says, "Robert, I'm going to get the Visa because nobody's the master but Jesus." And I wanted you to think about that language, right? Thinking about a word having many meanings. We sort of phrase it as a pun today, but in reality, when I was in grad school, the way that someone would refer to it is a metonym. And so along the way in life, you can sort of take a lot of those structures, those things that maybe prevent you from being in the places you want to be in. For example, when I applied to all the high schools I wanted to apply, I showed up to the high school that I really wanted to get into, so I dressed really nice. And I was in the midst of the interview, and the person asked me, they said, "So what major do you want to be?" And I looked at the list of majors that they had, and I was like, "This commercial arts thing sounds really good." And so I said, "I'd like to be in commercial arts." And then the person says, "Well, why would you like to be in commercial arts?" And I said, "Because I really like television and I like commercials." And for those of you who don't know, commercial arts is sort of the old terminology, I think, for design. And so at the time, design was really called commercial arts. But I looked through the word literally, and I thought of commercial, and the commercials that I come into my life most often. You can take those things and you can say, "Oh man, it's really terrible that you sort of grew in a home where you're confused by all these words." There's some humor into it, right? But then you can take those, you can play around with it a little bit. "I don't take nothing for granted, was born with a heart of granite, but granted, if I was granted Chief Commander, I would do better than Grant did." And that's with or without a grant, kid. So I want you to look at this image. This is cute little young Rob, and one of the things you might notice about that is Santa Claus is black. And even as a little kid at this age, I was really aware that Santa was black. So much so that I was crying because I got black Santa and then my cousin got the white Santa. What's interesting is if you think about your self-awareness at such a young age, to be able to notice the color of people's skin and associate that with values, already at that young age, I was already associating the color of one's skin with a value. A few years later, I got really excited because I moved to this new neighborhood. And in this new neighborhood, it was mostly white. Philadelphia was really segregated still in the 90s. Even today is really segregated. But I noticed this baseball field in the back. My dad bought me a baseball glove for my birthday, and so I went into the back, and I ran to the closest boys, and I was like, man, I'm going to play some baseball today. And so I said, hey, guys, can I play with you? One kid sort of kneeled down behind my knees. Another pushed me over, and then he put a baseball bat to my face. And he said, Spix mow the lawn. They don't play on it. So I want you to be really aware of color and language, because it's going to come up a few times in this presentation. One of the things I want you to think about is how the things that we sort of do every day prevent somebody from being able to do the normal things that they want to do. It's not necessarily that we're often sort of really racially driven, like we're saying a racial slur in a classroom or in any sort of situation, but oftentimes they come through in sort of this micro-aggressive way, sort of where we're in the midst of our conversation. And I was given an example earlier of my wife in school where she showed a picture of me for one of her classes, and it was about an entirely different subject, and someone just said that I looked like a Mexican gangster. And so me being somebody who just wanted to throw pottery, now was just like super aware how everybody looked at me, how it was completely different. And so that made it really hard to just go and like make pots and like really get my craft, really well oriented. So that challenged my everyday existence. One of the things that happened was my brother, who me and him slept I slept on the same bed for a long time. And as we got older, my brother, he had a baby when he was 15 years old. And we slowly started distancing ourselves from each other. But in graduate school, something really important happened in my life. At this point, my work was really trying to separate myself completely from where I came from. And then I was hit with my brother being locked up for 5 years. And I found myself in graduate school for ceramics, doing the thing that I really love to do. And one of the people that I love the most being locked behind bars. And I couldn't really operate. I couldn't really just keep making the work that I wanted because I just kept thinking about him. Is this video playing? If you hover over the bottom left of it, it should have a play button. There it goes. My brother's locked in the state pen. Me, I make art at Penn State. I'm a potter, I make plates. He in jail, he make plates. You see, I tried to be a student. Shit, I got home, I opened my cupboards, and all I saw was Stu Dan. I turned around, I got smacked. All I did was Stu Dan. I said, I'll join the synagogue. But when it came to church, I just saw its walls cracked by the cinder blocks. People's words went over my head like a cinder shot. And being fat leaves the world disappointed. Like a sinner's pop, I said I could be a veteran. Nah, but when it came to war, I just saw my pound jam. Like that veteran man gunshots. Give me a plate nice. Like Letterman, I can't be a Christian. I get confused who to thank for these pots that I'm pissing in. Listen in. I got dreams of change glistening. Shit, I would do some drug deals in Michigan just to put some 20s on my Michelins. Oh, fuck, not this again. So, where does ceramics come into all of this? Well, one of the things I want you to think about is how often do you guys hear about something on the news and then the next week we're on to like the new thing? Like last week we were talking about the political Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton. That's still going on. But then today we're talking about Kim Kardashian losing her jewels. That's like the main headline, right? $10 million is a big deal. But meanwhile, there's a bunch of kids being killed in Syria. That's like second page. Next week, it'll be about something different. So one of the things I think about is a story like Khalif Browder. It's very similar to my brother. Khalif was locked up in the incarceration system for some time. However, he wasn't actually there for a crime he committed. He was there because they sort of took him in during a bigger altercation. He actually got lost in the prison system for quite a long time. And when they found out, it became on the New York Times. He was eventually released, but he was so traumatized by that entire experience that he committed suicide. And so I often think about people like Khalif Browder and how to be able to tell their story, but often I think about how to keep the story going long after it's out of the news, long after it's out of the headlines. Because we have ceramics from literally 30,000 years ago. And so if I can create a work that sort of holds the story, I can keep it going long after I'm dead, long after the story's out of the news. Another sort of component that I try to include with my work is telling two sides of the story, because my experience is just one facet. Like the things that I just explained to you earlier, my own past experiences. But if I have my ideas on how the world should work, and you have your ideas on how the world should work, by me telling you that you should believe in what I believe in, that's not going to change anything. And we see that so often in politics when we look at sort of the Democrats and Republicans in the United States. You also see that a lot in rival gangs like the Bloods and the Crips, who would often wear sort of these bandanas that had the red and the blue print. So here I'm sort of comparing the two and using a self-portrait to be able to have this conversation with each other. So I'm going to show you a few instances where I sort of create a platform where, I use my own personal narrative, but I also look to other people to sort of fill in the parts that I don't know. For example, these are Toby mugs, and Tobys were the original police. And so Tobys were people that they would hire in England to be able to go pick up people that skipped out in the court system. And these people would just be in the bar all the time. They had really gnarly teeth, and they were usually super drunk. But there's a few instances where I was pulled over by the police, one of which they immediately asked if they can look at inside my car, and I was really afraid because I had all my pottery. I made sure to call it ceramics because I didn't want anybody confused with the word pot. And so they searched my car, and at the end of the day, I showed the officer one of my cups with my picture on it, and he still didn't believe me that I was a potter. He sort of looked at me with this really dismissive look. But I also remember this story about when I was 16 and I was lost in South Philadelphia. And when I was lost, SEPTA had gone on strike, the bus system in Philadelphia. And I had no way to get home because my mom always drove me or the bus always took me. And so I was lost and I had no idea how I could get home. And so I started sobbing some 20 miles away from where I live. And a police officer pulls up. This time I had no fear of police. This was just sort of an instance where I was really confused as to why he showed up. And he put me in his car and he took me home. And I was crying, and he's asking me a bunch of questions about sports. I can keep my mind off of the fact that I was really sort of traumatized at that point. So I realized sort of through both of these instances that there's two sides to one story, right? There's the people that have to send their husbands and wives out to work every day in the midst of sort of a cruel contemporary world. And there's also the people that send their children out into the world, expecting for police officers to take care of them. And the horrible things that we've heard that happen, people die. But see, my conversation is less about why did they die or who's at fault for them dying. It's more about, hey, if we actually put a value to this life and we say this person's someone's son, this person's someone's daughter, their father, we tend to look at that situation a little bit different because we stop immediately sort of assigning a blame to things, and instead we engage in a conversation. So that engagement in a conversation is really what a lot of my work is about. So when I think about a teapot, I think about two people coming together at a table, right? Usually you don't just like sit down and have tea for one. I mean, that's kind of like what you do with cereal, right? You just chill and have your little bowl of Lucky Charms, watch some Seinfeld. But with tea, usually there's a situation. It generally means that you're including more than one person. And so I like the idea that the teapot image almost immediately makes you think about two, or at least two. And so through my life, I've been sort of this racially ambiguous person. So I've been called a derogatory term for a Hispanic, a derogatory term for a black person. And I started to think about that when I was making this work, because I really sort of held Frederick Douglass at this high point in my life, almost in the same way that the people that originally commissioned these pots would commission somebody that they loved, their father or their son, or commemorate a marriage. This actual form was made in Hungary. And when I was over there visiting how they make these porcelain vessels, I found this sort of teapot with a straight spout. And that was made for, when people had horse and carriages, so the tea wouldn't just sort of like pour out. So the spout here really prevents anything from just popping out of it as the horse and buggy sort of goes up and down. But the spout in this case is sort of a bandana. And that bandana totes the Confederate flag. The Confederate flag comes from that same instance where I was pulled over by the police earlier when I was in Macon, Georgia, and I looked over and saw the biggest Confederate flag you've ever seen in your life. But also it comes from an experience I had in graduate school where I was stopping at the corner store to pick up a Diet Coke on my way to grad school because Diet Coke is really delicious. It's scrumptious, don't lie. But anyway, I stop, and then this guy pulls in, and these sort of, all these symbols, right? There's all this like language happening. He had this sort of really, and I mean, I wear a lot of camo, so not everybody who's camo is, you know, making a statement. But in this case, this person was. He was wearing, like, he had a big souped up camel truck with a bunch of Confederate flags on there, and he was really trying to make a statement. But that really didn't bother me as much as when I was sitting in line and he was talking to the guy at the register and he said, "You see who won the lottery last night?" And he said, "No." And he said, "Some fucking spick." And I was sandwiching between this guy and the guy at the register, just trying to buy a delicious, enjoyable Diet Coke. And I was thinking to myself about all the work that I had done to this point to sort of talk about a conversation, and all of a sudden I was hit right in the face with this experience to be reminded that these sort of aggressive situations happen every single day for people. And I was in the middle of central Pennsylvania. I could imagine how much it happens in the South. What part of central Pennsylvania was in the Confederacy? I'm still confused about that. But I often put my face in pottery, and I think one of the reasons why I put my face so often in pottery is because if you get told so often that you're ugly, that you're fat, if you get sort of all these things that make you feel like inferior, when you get the chance to sort of make a decision on how you take your artwork, you can put your own face on it. And so I think about it as putting my face in a place that doesn't belong. And I also think about how I can put other people's faces in a place they don't belong. There's a really great episode of This American Life recently on the school system of Mike Brown. And one day I spent some time in the studio, and it was 3 o'clock in the morning. And some of you may have done this in all of your studies where you're like, you've been reading a book and you fall asleep and then you wake up and you have all these notes, or you have sort of some evidence that you've been working all this time. And so I China painted this pot, and I was so angry. I was like, oh, I just like ruined it. I just drew my face on this pot. And then I started looking at it, and I said, no, that's actually the Mike Brown's cap and gown, and he and I share so many features. It just immediately thought that it was me, but it wasn't. And it really brought it home that this could have easily been me instead of Mike Brown. I think when I ask my audience to sort of put themselves in that place, if you can honestly stop thinking about Mike Brown or Trayvon Martin or any of the other sort of situations that have been in the news, somebody who doesn't really connect with you because they look different than you, then you're separating yourself, you're distancing yourself from it. But if you could imagine for a second and that person looks exactly like your father instead, or exactly like your sister, that's an entirely different story. Now all of a sudden that shit's personal. Okay? And so that's what it became for me. Here's one of the greatest pieces I've ever made. It's something that I didn't even throw myself. I found all these pieces in a thrift store. You know how you like go to the thrift store and they have all these old plates? And so I put it together to look like, you guys know Public Enemy and Flavor Flav had that big clock. He'd go, yeah, boy. So it reminded me of that, and I made this. But see, this is what my work aims to do, this next picture. Check that out, right? I didn't even plan that. This woman came to one of my shows. She's like, hey, can I wear that? And I was like, you sure can, as long as I can put it on Instagram. And then share it on Facebook. You don't know how many likes I got for that. So here's Basquiat. One of the reasons why I show Basquiat is because for years I've been sort of tagging my name with a crown on it, and I didn't even know who Basquiat was. I've been using his crown. I started to look at images from my childhood, like watching The Roots and Kunta Kinte, and thinking about how all of it relates to contemporary society, and how I wanted to sort of take a moment and where we are right now and compare to sort of the symbols that I'd grown up with, and also symbols that are several hundred years old. And so in this particular example, I got the inspiration to make this piece with Michelle Obama's speech on the house that slaves built. This is sort of a combination of decor from China, from Europe, but I get to decide who goes on it. So earlier when I sort of shared with you that story about me and my brother, and I said I was sort of talking about not having a pot to piss in, the way that I like to communicate it today is not only do I have one to piss in, but I can make it myself. And I find real great power and the ability to be able to create those vessels. Here's the old dirty bastard and Sojourner of Truth. One of the really interesting things is I find, like, you know, these two people are on opposite ends of how they're appreciated in society. The old dirty bastard, I mean, he gave himself that name, right? But the truth is that he did some really remarkable things in his lifetime. One of them was he went to the store on live TV with his kids and he had them pay for things with food stamps. This was a millionaire at the time. And they asked him later on, what's up with that? Why were you using food stamps? You're a millionaire. And you know what he said? He said, well, I wanted all the kids out there who are on food stamps, who have to go to the store every day to not to be ashamed. I wanted them to be able to see somebody doing that on television. That's a really remarkable thing for somebody to do. So this century vase, the form you saw earlier, this is for the 100th centennial of the United States, made in 1876. And so at the time in the vignettes, it sort of talked about all the innovations of the United States. And I choose to sort of go back and look at a lot of things that have happened in the last 100 years. This one is 100 years of immigration in the United States, or of being a refugee. And so one of the interesting things is the sign here of 3 people sort of crossing the road, and it says caution. And I think about how many of those signs I pass that have sort of the silhouette of a moose on it instead. And I love how someone created the sign that we sort of associated with, like, watch out for an animal. And it has people on it. And you immediately, even though these silhouettes are black, you're not assuming that they're white people. And so it has this sort of loaded connotation with it. And so I can look at this vase made for the 1876 World's Fair, and I can recontextualize it with my story, with the story of my peers. So this vase, a few of these vases, this vase, one of these was purchased by the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I have 2 others of these commissioned with museums that actually own the original vases. So my vase will sit next to these. If you can play this video as well. This is a century of war, and so as you can tell, it's kind of like my cross drawing of Abe Lincoln, but it's got Mussolini on there, a bunch of people I can't pronounce. It's got some goats on there, some graffiti, just kind of like a big heaping pot of all the things I think of when I think of war. Here's the image done. This is a 40 cooler. And so you know how people have wine coolers for when they have guests over? Well, in Philly, we drink a lot of 40s, you know what I mean? Like Colt 45 and all that. And you want that cold, you don't want that hot. Somebody serve you a hot beer, you're like. So when you're an adult, you can get one of my 40 coolers. Put that on your Christmas list 10 years from now. So here's a Prince teapot. One of the things I try my best not to do is just like think about somebody who just died and just put them on something. But when something happens, like one of my favorite things I heard about Prince was Eric Clapton, who's also one of my favorite musicians, was asked about Prince. And they said, what does it feel like to be the greatest guitarist in the world? And he said, well, I don't know, why don't you ask Prince? So one of the last things I'll sort of talk about in today's presentation is a little bit about, I think a lot of my conversation today has been about race, right? And so think about you and your life and all the sort of eclectic things that you enjoy about life, not just like what you're about outwardly. Like me, I feel like because of my experiences in pottery, I don't really have much of a choice but to what to talk about, because I want to create opportunities for other people that come from where I come from. But what I want you to think about is how sort of complicated every single human is and how we're about so many things and not just one. And so I am really self-aware because of how people have sort of interacted with me in my life. And so not only am I a person of color, but I've sort of suffered from obesity since I was a kid. These are some pieces I made with some people that are recovering from drug addiction, who wanted to make some examples of my work. But sort of this relationship between immediately being seen on the outside and have all these people make assumptions about who you are, this particular piece is called donut handcuffs. Me, I prefer people that empathize over people that exercise. You can work on your pecs and thighs until your body's next to God. But if your heart's anesthetized, you don't realize how your judgments affect my real life. Attempt to feel guys, you think you're real wise. But this pain can't heal my real pride. You see, I haven't seen my family for a year, and they gonna comment on my weight. That's what you say? I thought you was going to say, I miss you. I'm so ready to kiss you. Here's some letters I wrote you. I just want to say that I wish you lived close. But instead I hear some shit like, oh, are you drinking water? Have you tried calisthenics? Do you still got on your toes? Rob, I know you're diabetic. Stop asking me these questions, man. They come off as pathetic. You see in the news, they say obesity kills and I should live in fear. Well, how about showing me some fucking love while I'm still here? All that weight that I carry, man, it must feel like a boulder. Nah, the only shit that bothers me is the weight on my shoulders. I said, stop talking down to me. I said, enough's enough. Look, if I'm in prison in my body, then y'all providing the cuffs. So the truth is, guys, my life has really changed quite a bit. I went from somebody who was in graduate school and I didn't have much money. I was on food stamps through college. And I finally got out, and then somehow overnight, something amazing happened. I couldn't make enough work. People were buying my work for a lot of money. People were asking me to talk all over the country. And so I have to make really specific decisions about how much time I get to spend with my son. How much work do I make? Because I don't want to just make work to sell. I don't just want to make stuff to make money, because that really takes away from the work that I do. I'm making a very specific decision to come here today, okay? There's dozens of colleges that want me to come and talk to them, but I came here to talk to you specifically because I think it's important to reach places like Millbrook, to have this discourse start here, because I believe that you guys are mostly going to go to college, right? And you're going to have opportunities to engage in a conversation. And you're going to have an ability to be able to prevent somebody else from getting discriminated against in the same way that I was. You have the complete power to change the future of the visual arts, the future of humanity. And so I want to leave you with this. You know, I have sort of this opportunity to tell people exactly how I feel and use the stage that I've been presented with to just tell you how to change. But in reality, all it takes is inviting somebody to talk. And so I think about that guy at the store when I was just trying to get that delicious Diet Coke and how he sort of ruined the day for me, right? And so what I decided to do was put part of him on one of my pots, put the Confederate flag, something that represents him. And I put something that represents me. And my dream was that somehow he and I would sit down and have some tea and we could talk about things for a little bit. And then we figure out that we both really like the band Nirvana. We both really like the way that wood smells when it burns. We both really love visiting New York City. And once we find out all these connections all these ways that we're alike, I think we'd be less likely to oppress each other. I think we'd be filled with joy at how we found somebody so much like us. Thank you. Thanks, guys. So, in the spirit of engaging in conversation, I really tried to set up this presentation for a shorter period of time so that I could allow for questions and sort of an engagement. What I ask of you is to not have a fear of asking a question that you may feel is antagonistic. Ask a question because you genuinely want to know an answer to it, or you would at least like to know my response to it. So anyway, we'd like to open up the floor. Should I be the mediator for this and just select people? Is that okay? Sure. All right. Does anybody have a question they can think of? Yes.
So I know that your heritage within the history of the United States has influenced your work a lot. What about beyond?
My heritage outside of the United States? Do you mean like what am I planning on doing outside of the U.S. or like how are things outside of the U.S. affected me in the way that I work?
Like in your art, you showed a lot of stuff from like the show Roots and stuff like that from your early childhood.
Yeah.
History of slavery in the United States. What about like do you know about your personal heritage?
Yeah, this summer I went to Puerto Rico to start a pottery workshop. And so Puerto Rico has this really short but dynamic history where, very similar to America, Spanish conquered it and they brought African slaves over, but there was also a tribe that lived there called Taino. And so my heritage is Taino, and my family clearly has African within us. And so this summer was actually the first time, I'm 35 years old, this summer was the first time I've ever been to Puerto Rico. And the reason why is because my whole life I could not afford to go to Puerto Rico. And so the first time that I went to Puerto Rico was in order to create an opportunity for people that are like me, that are on the island, who have never sort of been able to work in a creative way. This is the thing about creativity, guys, is like it may not seem like a pragmatic thing. Like, you know, it's not like studying law or something where you know you'll be able to get a job. But this is the thing about creativity, is that when you're a creative person, you look at the world entirely differently. You start to focus on things. Like this morning, I was putting together a piece of like really awful IKEA furniture, right? Putting together a bookshelf. But before, I would like, you know, you guys ever put one of those together and then you have to stop at the end and just do the whole thing over again, right? But as an artist, honestly, it helps me put together IKEA furniture better because I'm really like focusing on, you know, which specific screws go and where. And so it helps me really hyper observe everything around me. Like when I'm giving a presentation, I'm like looking around for people that are really bored. And I'm like really going to where they are because I'm very emotionally intelligent, meaning that like I pick up on things and that comes through my creativity. And so when I go to a place like Puerto Rico to create a pottery workshop, yes, there's a hope that I'm going to sort of improve the financial sort of situation a lot of these people and offering them opportunity to use local clay to make things and be able to make money out of it. But there's also sort of this connection that I want to make with them about seeing the world that they live around, as sort of this place that's bountiful with opportunities. If you sort of have these creative experiences, you look at 12 different ways to attack one thing. That's actually why the CIA goes to a lot of art schools to recruit future agents. Yeah, fun fact. Fun fact. Does anybody have another question? Yes.
Were you very close with your family? Because you said when you were rapping that like they would always discriminate you that you were obese.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm really close with my family, but you know the truth is that you can like really love somebody and care for them, but go about it in an entirely different way that sort of makes them feel really small. And so I think for a lot of my family, saying something like, for example, one thing that happened recently is I tell somebody, hey, I lost 30 pounds. Which is really great, right? Like, you know, you're doing really good. But instead of like a congratulations, they'll tell you like, make sure you take care of yourself, which is sort of like completely dismissing the fact that I just did that. And you're sort of ignoring that and so I am really close with my family. And honestly, I'm always hoping to be able to like live near them. But I learned so much from the people that are closest to you and how they interact with you, because that says so much about how they see the world and how they interact with the world. If you're so apt to be able to say something like that to somebody who you love to sort of make them feel lesser than, can you imagine what those sort of people can do to someone else? And so that's the world that we live in. So I do reach from a lot of those places because I think immediately when I started maybe reciting that piece, a lot of people here probably related it to a part of their life, you know? And so I like to make those connections because I once took a poetry class, and the teacher like hated art. He's like, it's an art school too. He's like, I've never seen a really good piece of artwork in my life. Just these African spoons. And he's like, with poetry, the only way you can write a good poem is if it really comes from your life experience. And so I was such a sponge at the time that instead of sort of being really, dreamy and like writing these poems about all these things I wanted to see in the world, I just wrote from my experience and it really touched them. And what I realized is that, yes, it seems as though whenever I'm reaching for myself to understand other people, I'm able to make connections that I otherwise can't. And so that's why I think I talk a lot about my family, even though I have this really great relationship with them. I think that they've also provided me with a lot of the things that have made me feel really insecure throughout my life. And that's probably something that everybody in this room has felt in one way or another.
Sort of starting off with family aspect, what's the relationship you and your brother have?
My brother is a real interesting guy. My brother showed up to my wedding some years ago, and I made all these centerpieces for it. And then when we were outside, like, the bride and groom leaves and you have the sparklers, right, or whatever. And so my brother goes inside, he takes all the centerpieces, he put them in his trunk, and he starts hustling them outside. And the thing is my brother is this guy who, like, you can be really mad about that, but you can look at him and you can say, that makes complete sense for where you're from to do that. And I really enjoy being around him. And he's also somebody who, although I had been through quite a bit of things in my life, my brother has been through so many more things that I would never, speak on publicly. But my brother, he is out of prison and he's been a barber and he's starting his own barber business. And so he goes to businesses to like cut people's hair, and he's actually doing financially really well for himself. And he's only been out for a year now. And so we have this really great relationship, but honestly, I think that my family doesn't know how to interact with me because since I've started a career in art, it's completely foreign. In a way that no one in my family really went to college, and especially for the visual arts, and definitely not anything past an associate's degree. And so the things that I'm talking about, they sort of have a connection with him, but he doesn't just call me and say, hey, Rob, what do you think about, this theory, It's usually like, hey, Rob, the Eagles are doing really well, And so that's probably like it's like this love that we have for each other that doesn't need to come through a conversation about anything specifically. Like, we just figure out a way to talk with each other, and that fills the bliss of brotherhood, rather than it needing to be about we're connecting because we want to love each other. So I saw a question over here. Yeah.
I know you a long way, and I would like to ask if you want to define yourself using 2 words. What would those words be?
If I were to define myself with 2 words, I would say I would definitely, I guess humility wouldn't be the right word, maybe humble, because I've taken away the word feeling inferior and replaced it with humble. I just feel equal to people. And I would say the other word that maybe I think of is determined. No matter what successes I've had in life, and success is a really narrow thing, meaning like I've defined, based off of what I originally defined as success and where I'm at right now, I'm very successful, but I honestly stop certain systems that would create a way for me to stop being humble and stop being determined in order to keep my determination going. And so if my artwork is doing really well and it's selling a lot, I don't make as much, and I get myself to a new challenge to add to the discourse of my practice, because now I can sort of reach other people and give them opportunities. And so I would say that determination is a really important factor for me. I think about this image all the time. I went to a Matisse show. Do you guys know who Matisse is? Henry Matisse? The most famous painters. He had a cutout show recently at the museum, and they showed a picture of him on his deathbed, and it's this really long stick with a piece of charcoal at the end of it, and he was drawing on his deathbed. And I was thinking about that guy fucking meant it. You know what I mean? Like that's how I want to be at the end of my life. I want to like have a piece of charcoal on a really long stick and be doing something. Maybe I'll like get one of those laptop pottery wheels and just make one last pot. You know what I mean? So whatever you do in life, you know, I would just say mean it, you know? Yeah.
Let's take one more.
Yeah, okay. Man, I don't want to choose. All right, can we just take 2 more quick ones? Okay, you and you, yes.
I know you talked about coming to Millbrook and like, yes, nearly all of us are going to go to college.
Yeah.
But why come here? Why not go to a college where everyone is already going to college?
Yeah, because you are all going to different colleges. For the most part. You're not all going to the same one. And so a good example of that is the last lecture I gave right before this one was at the National Council for Arts Administrators. So I gave a talk to everybody who's in charge of an art school in the entire country. And so what I felt like if I was going to make an impact, it would be to a place that goes on to other places, right? And so I've also given talks at Phillips Exeter Academy, St. Paul's Academy, and different places where I've also been challenged on a lot of ideas. And I also, I think when I have interactions with students there, they tend to have a different outlook on life than when I go to other places. And sometimes there's actually a lot of similarities. And so I also gave a talk to 8 kids in an elementary school very similar to mine in Philadelphia. And so I also gave a talk to people recovering from drugs. And I gave a talk to people that were 80 years plus at a place in Baltimore, Maryland. And I find that all these interactions are really important. I don't want to just like hold myself to go into college after college after college. I really want to be able to engage in a diverse group of people. And I also don't want to just say to myself, I only want to speak at schools with really poor kids because those are the people I need. I need to talk to people at different places in the world. And I hope that they affect me, and I hope that somehow I can influence them in a positive way. Yes, so last question.
What was your drive that kept you going through all your tough times?
You know, honestly, I would say the drive was the adversity. Meaning, like when I got to undergraduate school, there was a lot of really sort of microaggressive things that happened. Some of them not so microaggressive. One of the instances we talked about earlier, someone wrote the N-word in hot pink letters, and 13-foot tall hot pink letters, and my school is an art installation on the exterior. That same week we had hired a black president. She drives into her parking spot and there's these big letters. If you're just making pottery and you're making pottery about sort of racial issues and then things just keep this popping up, you realize how important your voice is. And then when you look around a room, I go to a conference with 6,000 people and there's less than 10 black people in the whole conference. You get reminded, hey, what you're doing is like really important and super necessary. And so I would say maybe the lack of determination will eventually be that somehow my work and the work of my peers is being influential because we're starting to see less of that sort of lack of diversity. And so that constant reminder in one way or another has really helped me stay determined. And so that's a great question too. All right, so thank you guys so much for having me and for the arts faculty for inviting me. Thanks.